That's how you have to do it in church, little by bit, little bit at a time. As you know, we're doing favorite Bible stories, not verses, but stories, and I've asked a few people to give me their top 3, and I'm quite amazed of the different bits of the Bible that come up, which I find very exciting. And so we find ourselves in Nehemiah today. That's one of those clean pages, somewhere in the Old Testament. Let me set the scene. Nehemiah lives in Babylon, in the exile where the Jewish people got invaded by the Babylonian Empire, and then most of them got carted away to a faraway land in Babylon by the rivers of Babylon, you know the song, and Jerusalem got destroyed, the temple got wiped out, and the walls down, and stuff like that, and it was just sort of wiped. There was sort of a remnant left there, but all the intelligent people were carted off to Babylon to further their kingdom. And so Nehemiah finds himself in a pretty good job, actually. Tragic circumstances, far away, but he's actually got quite a good job. Thank you very much. He didn't do any sort of slave jobs, cleaning loos and what have you. He was the guy who poured the wine for the king, which sounds quite a nice job. The only trouble was he also had to taste it first, so that if somebody wanted to poison the king, Nehemiah would get it first, and then the king would know not to touch that wine. This is before health and safety laws were introduced for employees. It was okay to employ somebody to do that. And then everything goes pear-shaped because he gets a visit from a relative. And we know what that can be like. His brother comes to visit from Jerusalem with a few others, and he says to Nehemiah, "Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire." So this is, of course, no history lesson, because as much as Bible is interesting, I don't care that much what happened so many years ago unless I can apply it to today. So this is not about some walls half a world away and a few thousand years ago. This is about today's church. And it's a picture of the fact that church sometimes is run down. When I say church, of course is people, never buildings. Church has never been about buildings. We just call them church buildings. There's a song by a group called A Cappella, I think. They sing, "You can't go to church because the church is you. You can't actually go to church because the church is always people." In 1 Corinthians 3, this is what Paul writes. 1 Corinthians 3. "For we are God's fellow workers, you are God's field, God's building. By the grace God has given me, I laid a foundation as an expert builder, and someone else is building on it. But each one should be careful how he builds, for no one can lay any foundation other than the one already laid, which is Jesus Christ. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, wood, hay, or straw, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple." We are We are God's building, and therefore church is God's building site, because there's building going on all the time. It's sort of never finished. We know what that can be like. But therefore there's always a little bit of movement, of mess. Of course, it's not about the outside. It's about the inside. That's where God's building. He's not talking about literal gold, silver, hay, or straw. He's talking about the bits that need to be built up within the church. Church, again, being people. So the first thing Nehemiah has to do is face up to reality. Face up to the fact that although he's okay, half a world away, his homeland and the people that he is related to and loves are in trouble. And we have to face up to reality. You know, church, because church is people. People, of course, they're wonderful, gifted, beautiful, messy, obnoxious, annoying, a pain and sinful, complicated. People just are that way, aren't they? And we wouldn't have them any other way. You know, when the typical church tag goes, all welcome, well, that's the complication with it, isn't it? Literally, all are welcome. We don't screen them for godliness or holiness or niceness at all. Church welcomes just normal people, not just perfect ones. And with people comes chaos and friction and conflict and misunderstandings and sin. You know, the church community is not immune to trouble and bitchiness and sinfulness, because we just are people. It's just that often we're shocked because Christians ought to be nice, and sometimes that's why church is such a complicated ship to steer and to be in, because although we're not nice, sometimes we ought to be nice. And you know, where in a normal job you just tell somebody to, well, or you are told to I don't know, F off, and you know, get a grip and just buckle down and sit down and shut up and do as you're told. We can't do that in church, can we? We have to be nice. And therefore a lot of things that just come up and blow up and then are cleared, like a thunderstorm clears the air. There's often this sort of, or it can creep in, this heaviness where things that should be said are left unsaid. Not telling that we have to start swearing at each other, you know. But the things that ought to be said ought to be said in a constructive way. Nearly said in a nice way, but that's not, you know, that's counterproductive. In a constructive, encouraging way. Because we're normal people, and as normal people, we're still building our own house too. We're not mature, however old you are. You know, I would have thought that by the age of, well, my age, 40, I would have sort of grown up. Well, if I haven't, what was that quote? That if you haven't grown up by the age of 40, you don't have to. It's like that, but it's not just our own normal maturity, it's also our spiritual maturity. We haven't grown up yet. Some of us are still building, some of us are renovating their ruins, you know, papering and decorating and stuff. The real tragedy, though, is not when there's building work, but then when there's no building work. Do you know those traffic jams on the motorway because there's roadworks? And it says, careful workmen, and you don't see anyone. How tragic is that? How tragic is it when there's no work going on anymore? Where I grew up en route to my mum and dad's house, they built a block of flat just in the edge of the city. Beautiful, you know. block of flats, about 7 stories high, and it's in a really nice area, nice estate, and countryside just on the back door and stuff. And they built it, and windows were in, and it was painted and stuff, and nobody ever moved in because they hadn't finished it. And it stood there empty for years. And then, of course, it gets run down, and weeds grow over the top of it, and windows got smashed. And it was just so sad to watch a building that shot up and looked beautiful, just nobody wanted it. It never got finished. That's worse, isn't it? It's worse when there's no work going on at church anymore, where we just meet and that's it. There is no interaction, no building work going on. When community becomes stagnant, when relationships plateau. Good old Cliff Richard sang, it's so funny we don't talk anymore. It's not really funny at all, is it? That's probably the worst state. When you've still got something to argue about, you're in a better shape than when you've stopped talking, when you ignore one another. And it's the same in church when there's no interaction on anymore, when there's no conflict, no movement, no nothing, no building work, where God's allowed to show up and bless, but nothing else. Then we're in a sad state. So we've got to face up to reality, the fact that we're not there yet, that there's still building work to be done, and when there's building work, there is a bit of mess and a bit of chaos, and that's okay. The second thing that we have to do is we have to react, and Nehemiah reacts in a few different ways. Verse 4, Nehemiah 1, it says, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept." That's good, isn't it? First reaction, have a good old sob about things. When was the last time you cried because of the state of the church? Or the state of our church? When was the last time you cried because of your own state, your own building state? When perhaps things are not plumb, or things have crumbled, or you've forgotten to put something else in place. So he has a good cry. Because he's passionate. He doesn't leave him cold. And then he says, "For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." Fasting and praying. We've got the 24-hour prayer day coming up. He does it for days, for some days. How long that is, who knows? But 24 hours just sounds such a long time, doesn't it? Normally, you pray and then people run out of stuff to say and you glance at the watch and already done 10 minutes. And my shopping list is finished and God knows everything. And that's normally how we pray, and then we say amen and we hang up. And we leave the conversation. But the beauty of a 24-hour or praying for some days is that God can do a work. Because praying is not about a telephone call type of communication. It's about a relationship, about spending time in His presence, and then He can work in your heart, and He can give you some thoughts, and you can then pray them, and then sometimes He leads you to something else to read, and there's a process. Prayer is a process rather than something you say. And that takes time, because often the most exciting time in prayer comes when we've run out of stuff to say. And then real relationship happens. It's like when you meet people after a long time, you sort of catch up and how are you doing? And then eventually, you've sort of shared everything that's new. And But you could do that with the girl at the checkout. You can also share what's new. But then the real relationship, the real friendship happens when you run out of stuff to say, and then you go to a more personal level. It's the same in prayer. So I'd encourage you, 28th. So Nehemiah, he prays for forgiveness, and he prays that Jerusalem will be built up again, and he asks God for an opportunity to speak to the king. And then 4 months, nothing. No opportunity to speak. Nothing happens for 4 months. 4 months to you and me sounds like a short time. For some, it's long, but there's nothing. Nothing happens. And then this happens. In the month of Nisan, no car, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before. A joyful fellow to have around, isn't it? So the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. We don't quite get the gravity of this. You weren't allowed to be sad in the king's presence. That was a serious offense. Never mind poisonous wine. It could be, head off or something like that, because, the king wanted entertainment. That's why he says, Nehemiah, I was very much afraid. But I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. And what he answers is magnificent, because whilst he was praying, he wasn't just praying. He's been planning as well. Listen to this. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried, so that I can rebuild it. The king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, how long will your journey take, and when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me, so I set the time. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah, and may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the king's forest, so it will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city walls, and for the residence I will occupy. See, he's not been just praying, oh Lord, please. He's also been active in planning. He knew exactly what he needed. He knew that he needed some officials, some paperwork, building regulations approval, that sort of stuff. He needed materials. He needed to make sure that transportation was safe. He's been planning. Sometimes you hear, oh, all we need is prayer. Sounds very holy. All we need is prayer. And we do. Beatles sang it differently, but we don't just need prayer. Sometimes it can be a shallow excuse to remain on your bum. Tim, the guy we started MCC with, when people, he asked you to be involved, and whenever he heard people say to him, tell you what, I'll pray about it. He said, no, that's just a shallow excuse. You need to decide whether you're going to be involved or not. It can be just an excuse for inaction. Sometimes it's true, all we can do is pray. But often it's an excuse just to remain a spectator. Nehemiah didn't just sit and sob and pray. He was planning action as well. He was dreaming what it's going to be like when it's rebuilt. And he educated himself, because he was a glorified waiter. He wasn't a builder of city walls. So I'm sure he must have read up, and he must have read up who the letters need to come from, and so on. He was planning, actively engaging in the process. And the fourth reaction is not really a reaction, it's action. He sets off. Long story, read it, it's fascinating reading. But eventually, with serious opposition and drawbacks and fights and so on, he gets the walls finished. And, woo, everybody's happy, and they recommit themselves to the law of Moses, and it's just a real sort of revival going on. When we build, the foundation's got to be Jesus, like we read earlier. Otherwise, it's a sort of a disaster, really, because everything, foundations apparently are very important. Otherwise, the whole building will lean and will sink and will wobble, and it's just not right. But once that's in place, then we can think of building the rest. Once we're sure that Jesus is in charge, that Jesus is the one that makes everything work and grow, then we can think about the rest. In 1 Peter 2, it says, 1 Peter 2:5. As you come to him, the living stone, rejected by men but chosen by God and precious to him, you also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You are living stones, not bricks. Bricks are man-made. They're all square. They all look alike, 8 sides and whatever they have, and they're all uniform, staffed as the other. But stones are individuals. Each one's different. And that's why you can build a dry stone wall without any mortar in between, because each stone supports the other one. Now, just because it's church doesn't mean everything's wonderful and everything fits together beautifully all the time. It takes, just with the dry stone wall, it actually takes some serious work and some skill and patience and a lot of time and choosing carefully and placing carefully and sometimes a bit of chipping so that the stones match perfectly, and then the whole thing will hold together, and it will support each stone supports the other. That's the idea of living stones. In one of my parents' friends, he used to work in the Austrian embassy in New Delhi. If you've ever been to an embassy, have you ever been to a British embassy anywhere? Okay, let me fill you in. Usually embassies don't conduct their work from a porter-cabin, right? It's usually a grand affair. All the embassies in London are in Belgravia, so it's quite a posh do, and the huge columns and grand buildings, because they are sort of the they show off your country. That's why they build it as grand as they can. And the Austrian embassy in New Delhi was no different. It was a grand affair, and they built a new entrance hall, like an atrium or something like that. And in it, they had a pool and a water fountain. And the trouble was that they couldn't switch it on because the pump was too powerful, or the ceiling was too low, or the pool was too small, or a combination of all three. Anyway, if they ever switched it on, the whole entrance hall would flood because they just went everywhere. There wasn't communication between probably the plumber, the builder, the architect. somebody just thought it was a great idea and didn't tell the architect to make the ceiling higher or whatever it was. There was miscommunication going on between different departments. And even in our small setting here, there's a lot of things going on through MCC and Impact. And they only make sense in the context of the whole church. Art group only makes sense in the context of the whole church. Because if it was just about art group, for example, that's not what we're about. Otherwise, we do a craft fair. We are a craft fair or whatever. We're not an art college. But what we can do and do, and why we do it, is because God just loves to work creatively. And when we work creatively, we connect with God. We run a cafe. But is that all we're about? Not really. Otherwise we'd be called Costa. And we'd charge a lot more. But we run a cafe because we want people to come in and we want to be part of the community where normal people that have nothing to do with church coffee mornings and stale biscuits can come in and just enjoy being around, and we can connect with them and get to know them, and that's how we work. Is Sunday what we're all about? No. There are 6 other days in the week. Sunday we celebrate and we connect with God corporately, and we sing and pray and we learn and are with each other. Everything only makes sense in its wider context. Just like a wall. It would be silly, wouldn't it, if you build a wall here, freestanding, and then you build another one here, freestanding, and then you build another one over there, freestanding. They wobble because they're not connected, and you can push them over. What for? There's no building, it's just individual walls. Let me sum up. Everyone is important. Every stone is important. On a building site, everything is important. The guy who hammers the nails in is important. The guy who orders the nails is important, and so on. There's a story. I saw 2 workmen once on the road. One was digging a hole, and the other one filled it. And then they walked 50 meters, and then one dug a hole, and the other one filled it 50 meters, dug a hole, filled it. I get the picture. They just kept doing that. So I walk up to them and said, "Come on, it's unbelievable. What are you doing there? You can't just, what's the point?" And he said, "Well, there's normally 3 of us, but the guy who puts the tree in is ill." See, unless everybody does their bit, it does not make sense. It doesn't make sense to just do art group. It doesn't make sense to just worship. It doesn't make sense to just brew up. It doesn't make sense just to preach. It doesn't make sense just to cook on a Thursday and on a Sunday. But together, it's a beautiful picture. Together, it all makes sense. So church is a building site, and therefore there's always a bit of chaos. There's always a bit of change. We can change our plans. God change our plans. If you like a church to be finished, then you should go and look for a different one. Because we're not going to be finished, because God's not finished with us. God's not finished with his community. Communities change, people get older, they move on, seasons in lives change, seasons in communities change, and therefore God works dynamically. God's the same yesterday and forever, but it changes all the time because people change. And therefore our church will never finish. And our lives are building sites too. We're not finished. We live and breathe and transform and morph. We are being transformed.
let me just tell you that walls can be rebuilt. You know, sometimes when everything comes crumbling down, it can be rebuilt. And sometimes it can be a difficult process. One of the bits in Nehemiah is really cool. They have serious opposition. Some people, some other powers to be around Israel didn't like Jerusalem to be rebuilt and gain its strength again. So they came and shouted abuse and threatened them with attacking them and so on, to the point where the workmen had to build with one hand and in the other one hold a sword. And sometimes that's how it feels when we rebuild our lives. There's work to be done, but there's also some defending to be done from people, from forces and powers that don't like you to be restored. And sometimes that's ourselves. Sometimes it's we just get used to ruins. Ruins are quite nice, aren't they? Popular. Let's list them. But you can't live in ruins. You know, they're perhaps sometimes pleasant or interesting to look at, but you can't live there permanently. So we need to do a bit of defending work as well as building work to get the job done. But they can be rebuilt. They can be, and they will be. Let's pray. Lord God, your church is a fascinating thing because it lives and breathes, and it does other things too. And sometimes they're not pleasant because we're people, real people with real problems and real sinfulness, and sometimes we can be really obnoxious and difficult and complicated. And yet, Lord, it's those quirks that link us, that interlock us with others. We're not uniform bricks, but we are living stones. We're alive, and we move, and we change. And you knit us together to a beautiful building. Lord, we pray that each one of us will get it, that I am really, really important for the whole thing to function. Because if I withhold my gifts, if I withhold my talents, if I withhold my purpose from this community, it won't function quite as well. There'll be a tree missing somewhere. There might be a voice missing. There might be a message from you missing. There might be too much dirt on the walls. There might be shopping missing. Whatever it may be, though. What we do, what each one of us does, is crucially important. Lord, and we thank you that just as Jerusalem, after devastating disaster, could be rebuilt, just like that, our lives can be rebuilt too. I pray as we face our own ruins, our own disasters, Lord, sometimes it will cause us to just sob, and sometimes it's better out than in. But let it not stay in that. Let it not just stay in sorrow and mourning. But help us to just present it to you in fasting and praying, in just focusing on you. And over time, a sense of purpose, a dream, a plan, action, and a new way of thinking will evolve as we pray. Because you will transform our mind, you will transform our thinking, and you will transform our feeling, you will transform our desperation into hope and passion. And I ask you that when the time comes to done our planning, our dreaming, our educating, and we're ready to go. I pray that we don't stop in the sob, we don't stop just in the praying and fasting, but we'll also move with you in our own lives where things have to be rebuilt and restored, and in the lives of our community, church, and the wider community, where things need to get better, where we need to put our hands to a plow or a shovel or a duster or whatever it may be, and change and rebuild our community. Let me encourage you. I don't normally get to stand right at the back, but today I did, and I saw what I spoke about. Everybody's important. I saw that in action this morning, and it was beautiful. We were singing, and David and Rachel had a hug, and just enjoyed their presence in God's presence. And Shirley had Reuben on her knee, and John went across to the kids, and it was just beautiful how it worked together without having to be scheduled. And so let me just encourage you, it's happening, and let's rejoice in it and spur each other on to experience that miracle.
Tomorrow, my granddaughter goes into hospital to have a lump. You can assure that it is benign, it's been growing for years, it's on her rib cage, they actually don't know what it is, and she's having that done on Tuesday. I would please pray that you will pray for her.
Is that Taps?
Absolutely.
I will pray for Taps right now. Pray that you will calm the nerves and calm the nerves of everybody who's anxious for her. And we just pray, Lord, that it will be removed, and that's it. Whatever it may be, Lord, we pray that that will be the end of it. Lord, we pray for